Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Oh, a little bit of video delay here, but I believe we're on the same page. I'll just go ahead with a question then. Kind of going right into what's happened in this past year, could you walk us through what it was like from your perspective to be trying to guide and lead Ola through, especially the early months of the pandemic, when everything was so uncertain, there was so much fear, and what was it like for you to be sort of making decisions at that point in time? Or do you remember kind of specifically when it was that it hit you the full kind of profound impact that the pandemic was going to have, not just on the country and the world, but specifically on how you operated?
Sure, Matt, wonderful to meet you. And I thank Rudra and Shruti for this wonderful event and great to be here. And Matt, I think that's a very relevant question upfront. First, when I was taken up by surprise by the pandemic, and specifically, I was actually in the UK setting up our London business when the pandemic just started getting up to speed. And I was starting to see the cases rise in Europe, etc. It was still uncertain on how it will impact India or how it will impact China was kind of starting to. And then, I remember taking one of the last flights back to India from London, last commercial flights back to India and getting here and then realizing that it's going to be a tough time ahead. And rightly so, the Indian government established a strong lockdown protocol, and that was required the pandemic through for the mobility industry. Those 2-3 months were very tough, especially for the mobility industry, which is the mobility services industry. So our focus in the first couple of months in India and in our global markets like the UK, Australia, elsewhere was to make sure our drivers are well taken care of, to make sure whatever we can do in our capacity to provide them either insurance or some kind of safety of work or whatever is possible, we do. And we ended up doing a bunch of things in that regard for our driver community. And also, we partnered with governments across India and globally in all our markets to help citizens, especially those who need to access healthcare or to access, maybe some food in some cases in parts of India, etc., wherever distribution systems are not as good. So there was a bit of this element of taking care of the ecosystem, making sure we can do whatever in our bit to help that. But also, it also gave us time to rethink our entire business, the entire industry's approach to the business going forward. And I actually believe in that ways, the pandemic has thrown up much more opportunities than challenges. Right? Across the spectrum, we are seeing technological change accelerate. We are seeing what was going to happen in 10 years happening in within a year. And even in the industry, it was a major force towards growing usage of ride-sharing platforms. While it took a blip temporarily, if you look at the mobility broadly, there are 3 ways people use mobility: either their own cars, or ride-sharing platforms, or public transport. Now, I believe with this pandemic, the acceleration of the downward slide of public transport has begun, and it was anyways with autonomous mobility, with autonomous pods roaming around connected streets and roads, etc. But that consumer use case to shared economy usages like ours, and that throws up a big challenge to companies like ours. How do we provide hygienic, safe experiences for consumers around the globe? How do we leverage technology and best operational procedures to really deliver to consumers increased expectations after the pandemic? And we focus a lot on that with our brand and with our technology. In addition to that, I can see a lot more focus from nations and communities on more sustainable forms of transport. I believe that transport is by a few years because of the pandemic. Europe really focusing a lot more on accelerating the journey to sustainable mobility. And we are seeing even in India, the Indian government leaning in very strongly to make electric mobility a mainstay for the future. And if the transition to electric was going to happen over, let's say, a decade to, let's say, quarter penetration, I think that's been pulled in by 3 to 5 years. So that's a bit of a long answer to your short question, Matt. But initially hiccups and challenges like everybody else. But in the long term, I think there's a lot of opportunity that's been created.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating, especially this acceleration of some trends while maybe turning back some other ones that, at least temporarily, that we saw moving that seemed almost inevitable, like the move towards a lot more shared rides. Speaking on the electric side of it and the autonomous side of it, I know that last year Ola set up the Advanced Technology Center in my hometown, in my home area, the Bay Area, California. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to what the ambitions are in that space, and in what ways do these type of international connections are they sort of crucial to moving Ola forward in this type of, particularly the cutting edge technology portion of it, as opposed to the sort of the business model driven portion of it?
Matt, sorry, I lost you in the middle. Could you please repeat the question?
Sure. I was wondering if you could speak more towards the trend toward electrification, and also you mentioned briefly possibly autonomy. I know that last year you opened up the Advanced Technology Center in the Bay Area, where I'm from, and I was wondering if you could speak to what role the type of international connections or transnational research networks play in advancing those objectives.
I think that's a great question and a very relevant contextual question, Matt. Let me actually take a step back and talk about innovation in mobility in general, and then go deeper into those two segments. I actually believe the next 2 or 3 decades, we will see a lot of innovation in mobility and transportation and logistics technologies in general. If you look at the past 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of innovation with communications technologies, and so much value created around the world with companies like Amazon, Alibaba, Apple, etc. But all of these are built on the communications technology stack. There was a time before that where transportation companies like GM and or fuel companies were the largest companies in the world. And sometimes these innovations happen in cycles. So I believe starting somewhere 5 to 10 years back to 20, 30 years in the future, we'll see a 2-3 decade massive shift in the way we transport things and the way we move. And it started with, let's say, the ride sharing business model innovation because of better connectivity. Then it went into electrification of vehicles. Started with the West, and the large consumer trucks and the large commercial buses and trucks and the luxury sedans and all, which is what a company like Tesla, etc., is focused on. But over the next few years, we'll see a lot more broad penetration of this technology into a vast market of use cases which are not served by Western companies. If you look at India has a vehicle park, a total of about 200 million two-wheelers in total in the market, and only about 30 million four-wheelers. And that's the story across Asia and Africa and many of the developing world. And even if you look at many parts of the developed world like Europe, etc., the form factors are not just large luxury sedans. These are small, compact city cars also. So our belief is that if for electric mobility to really have a transformational impact for the whole world, we need to solve for two-wheelers, three-wheelers, city cars, small cars, etc., which form a majority of the miles and the majority of the fuel burnt in the world. And that's what we've focused on. And similarly, on this theme, the theme of connectivity in vehicles and autonomous mobility, also have for them to truly be successful around the world, they need to have a unique developing country dynamic built into them. Right? And that's what I actually think India as an ecosystem has going for it. India is a developing country, but also it can partner with, because of the cultural similarities, shared history with the Western world, we can partner much more closely to develop these technology paradigms for the future, which would be sort of like an open rules or a more collaborative rule system for the future of mobility. And I believe those kind of engagements are getting started now, and we'll, on top of those kind of foundational protocol and policy engagements, we'll see a lot of technology innovation going forward.
Yeah, I'm interested in that sort of developing country dynamic. You mentioned that right at the start of the pandemic, you were actually in the UK, and you're working, I believe, on the sort of the continuance or the growth of your business over there. And if I'm remembering this correctly, you've also launched services in Australia.
Yes.
And so the initial expansion for Ola has been to develop markets. Has there been some thought to maybe trying to work on the competitive advantage in other developing markets in Southeast Asia and beyond, where there's not maybe as much of an incumbency to companies like Uber? Or do you see it as an important step to establish oneself in the developed markets first and then kind of move from there?
The unique strength of being an Indian company grown out of India is, we have a very large home market in India, very large consumer internet market, and growing fast. And there's 1.3 billion people, so there's enough people to serve in India at a certain price point, right? And another advantage of India is the technology talent available here is as best as anywhere in the world. So our technology platforms and our research and innovation capabilities are as good as any other company in the world. Now, when we looked at our strategic priorities looking forward, we said, to be a leading player in mobility in the world, we need to obviously be very strong in our home market, which is India, but also have the technological prowess and competitive abilities with the best in the world in the best, most competitive markets in the world. And those are the Western markets like Europe, North America, Australia, etc. And we chose specifically the Commonwealth to expand into because of the cultural connections with India. The legal systems are similar. There's a lot of Indians who live in these countries, a lot of business travel and cultural travel from these countries. All of these countries play cricket. So, yeah. So, but that just speaks about the shared heritage, and an Indian company is very welcome in these countries. And looking ahead, if I extrapolate this trend for the entire Indian startup or the technology ecosystem, I believe the opportunities, given the geopolitical dynamics today and the technology talent strength of India and the large home consumer market of India, the opportunities for Indian businesses to set global technology paradigms is only going up. And people sometimes talk about the American model and the Chinese model. I believe there'll be another model called the Indian model, which would be which will talk more about the ethos of India and the collaborative, empathetic nature of doing business in India versus a disruptive nature or a very insular approach. Yeah,
that's very interesting. Kind of another major trend that's emerged during the pandemic is, of course, what this conference is about, which is the geopolitics of technology. My sort of background is in U.S.-China ties and artificial intelligence, clearly a very real role over the past couple of years. And obviously, India-China ties have gotten a lot more tense, and there have been, different kind of walls going up between these markets. One thing that has kind of emerged out of that or leading into it even, is the emphasis on Indian self-reliance across a bunch of different sectors, but especially in technology. I'm wondering how you evaluate sort of India's ability or even the desirability of self-reliance in technology at this point. Is the ecosystem still at a stage where there is something of a need for capital from outside or from talent who has gone abroad and come back? Or do you think that it's really at a kind of totally self-sustaining point?
Yeah, actually, Matt, it's a very interesting point of conversation on self-reliance. I actually believe the Prime Minister's vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat is slightly different in context to self-reliance. I don't believe this is about the earlier generations' approach to import substitution or economic policies of that sort. It's more about strengthening our supply chain, strengthening our capabilities to provide to the world from a position of strength. And it's about discovering what is India's strength. India's strength is its talent. India's strength is its domestic market. Its strength is its own strong supply base also in many parts of the value chain. So it's a little different nuance from where I see it. And when you think of it like that, you can see companies like ourselves not thinking from a defensive standpoint of closing down the economy to only us, but actually thinking of let's figure out our strength, let's build that strength, and let's engage with the world. So the Prime Minister's and then the government's call is much more of a forward-looking, positive engagement with the world versus a regressive, inward-looking shutting down of ourselves. Now, specifically on the India-China dynamic, I actually believe businesses like ours, etc., obviously have to. We gain the benefits and the we have to deal with whatever geopolitical situations there are between nations. And as an Indian, I definitely have a point of view on that. As a businessman, I actually see opportunity also. I see opportunity that an Indian company is very well regarded on the global stage. The Indian way of doing business is in general appreciated, more collaborative, more open, and we feel that's an opportunity for us to actually partner more deeper with global companies and global countries to build into the future technology paradigms.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on that sort of collaborative element of it. I've heard you speak on this before and saying, the American disruptive model is one thing, but in India, oftentimes it's not. There's nothing to disrupt. You have to create from the ground up, and oftentimes that means partnering with the government in sort of scaling these platforms or building up kind of a social layer that underlies them. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to sort of how that collaborative element has manifested in India, and then whether or not you see an element of that as you begin to expand outside of India to the Commonwealth countries or beyond that.
Actually, I'll start from a philosophical element, and I'll go into the specifics. So, one of the core elements of the Indian ethos is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the whole world is a family. And and as you grow up in India, you realize, because India is a complex place, and a lot of people, a lot of cultures, etc. So you have to give each other space, and you have to the many languages. You have to learn many languages in school growing up. India is still a very developing economy, so traditionally infrastructure is less developed, so you have to make do with lesser. And as a businessman, when you look at that opportunity, you have to leapfrog and help create rather than disrupt something existing. Right. So if you add all these things together, the kind of ethos an Indian businessman grows up in is much more of a creation ethos versus out with the old and in with the new. There's nothing old in India, right? And the Indian cultural ethos is also about giving, being empathetic with each other, understanding each other's space, and building for the future along with it. So being technologically advanced and building for the future, but building in harmony with the environment, with other stakeholders, and with your internal stakeholders like employees, etc. So that's a big focus of us as a company on how we do business, and we've been expanding globally with that approach of partnering with regulators around the world, developing into their agenda, be it climate change or electrification or the gig economy themes or the privacy concerns of citizens. And all these themes are different in each geography. India has its own because of its own development curve. Some of these themes are higher or lower in their impact. Whereas in the UK, for example, it'll be very different. In Australia, where the conversation on electrification and climate change is in a slightly different direction than, let's say, Europe. So as a company, we try and balance our approach into the priorities of the governments and the countries and the communities we go in.
Great. I want to leave time for audience questions, which are starting to come in. But maybe before that, just kind of one final forward-looking question for you. The pandemic has changed so much, both in terms of business models and trends around sharing, at least in the present moment, around the electrification trends that you mentioned. I'd say, what are kind of the maybe one or two big ways that your thinking has changed over the last 10 months from the beginning of the pandemic to the present day?
Matt, I think the most important change is the change in the psyche of the consumer across markets. Sustainability today is not a mandate of some investor groups or some countries, etc. Sustainability is what the average consumer expects today. They expect brands to be responsible. They expect brands to care about their communities also. And these are not just a niche early adopter kind of a consumer base anymore. This is a much larger, broader consumer who wants brands to be responsible towards society, responsible towards environment, responsible towards their specific needs, and as far as that business is focusing on. So, I think that's one big trend which was already underway across the world with more connected consumers, but the pandemic accelerated that a lot. It made us all aware about the need for these things across all markets, be it India or the US. And I think that's a trend which is only going to further enhance, and that's made companies focus a lot more on maybe things which are important to do but not urgent to do. Right? And that's the one theme which I believe will impact business models, impact boardroom discussions, impact employees, etc. around the world.
Great. Well, bring in some audience questions now that kind of actually speak directly to that component right there. One question from an audience member is, how can India ensure affordability and accessibility of electric vehicles when it is so import dependent for key raw materials and charging infrastructure at this relatively nascent stage?
That's a great question. The ecosystem is still in its nascent phase. Although the good thing is the technologies around electrification are getting to a certain inflection point where the cost curve is now coming down. The technologies are advancing, so deployment globally is advancing. So the supply chains are becoming more mature, and hence the cost is coming down for key raw materials, etc. I'm going to break that point into two specific components. One is the raw material sourcing, and one is the manufacturing of key components like chargers and cells and batteries, etc. Now, the raw material sourcing, the electric value chain, the key component value chain, there is some part of that value chain in India, some part of that outside of India. And beyond a point, I think we will have to rely on a global network of these supply chains to deliver those raw materials. The good thing is it'll be more, in my view, it'll be more broader than the oil value chain globally, because some of these minerals are more broader and not as rare. As far as the manufacturing of key components is concerned, I believe it's a matter of time before those capabilities and technologies are built in India. And it's a big opportunity for entrepreneurs. For us, we are diving head on, and we are looking to build the key technology competencies to create batteries, cells, motors, chargers, etc., all in India. And the great thing is, in India being a market-driven economy, and given the kind of investor interest in India, this is the best time to set up those kind of organizations and businesses. And from the Indian market scale and technology talent base, we can actually serve the entire world for these technologies. So I actually believe that it'll, in the next couple of years, we'll see a lot of momentum in building core competency in technologies for electrification in India. The raw materials will be a global supply chain like for any other nation.
Wonder if we could double down on kind of that question of domestic manufacturing, of manufacturing in India of these components. There's a question here about investing in electric vehicle manufacturer in, pardon me if I mispronounce this, but Hosur. I'm new, what can I do? The question is around what's the motivation for that? And I guess maybe sort of my additional question on top of that is how do you think about balancing building these capabilities within Ola versus investing in key players partnering? So sort of kind of a vertically integrated electric vehicle chain here versus kind of building an ecosystem that you want to be a part of more broadly.
Sure. So if I take the big picture first and then the specific point, India has a good opportunity to be a manufacturing leader in the Industry 4.0 era, and it's because India has good talent at relatively lower costs for manufacturing. India has a software technology, digital technology talent to play in the Industry 4.0 era. And and India already in the automotive space has a reasonably globally competent manufacturing and supply chain ecosystem. So our approach is, we want to build India as a base for global electric vehicle and electric technology manufacturing. We are setting up our first plant in Hosur, which is what the question is referring to. And it'll be the world's largest two-wheeler plant when it's fully up and running over the next couple of years. And from here, along with a supply base within India of global companies. The supply base within India need not be only of Indian companies. There are global companies which have their manufacturing centers in India who are tier 1 suppliers to OEMs. So from that, we believe we can build with the best technology of Industry 4.0 and export to many parts of the world from here in India. Now, so that's the specific point on Hosur. Matt, what was your question on top of this?
Just the desire to sort of build all these capabilities within Ola versus participating in a broader sort of ecosystem that's outside of you.
So when we look at opportunities like these, right, we start with the consumer product experience required to be built, and then we work backwards from there and decide, is there any core value proposition that we should be designing and engineering and building in-house, and what all can somebody do better than us, and then hence we should do it in partnership with somebody. Now, being a ride-hailing company, that was our origins. But when we saw the electric vehicle opportunity and the chance to actually accelerate the transition to sustainable mobility across the world, we felt, given the situation of technology and supply chain in India, we will have to build our own vehicles, and that's what we invested into creating our capabilities. But while doing that, manufacturing is a game where you can't do everything. So when I look at our own products, about 50% of the value will be by ourselves, and 50% of the value will be through partnerships with key global suppliers for maybe cells or motors or controllers or magnets or what have you. So it's always we try and see what all we should control in-house. And in any new technology domain like electric vehicles, it's also important to control enough in-house to accelerate the journey. Otherwise, you'll be waiting for the whole ecosystem to grow around you, and that never happens in a fast scale-up phase.
Great. There's another question here, specifically on the interaction between the gig economy and unemployment and growth in India. I wonder if you could speak to whether you see the gig economy as really being a sort of quote unquote solution to that, or is it maybe just one small piece of it? And the additional question from the audience on top of that is, how do you see AI impacting that? I think, here in the US, there have been a few remarks from folks at Uber and whatnot that things will finally work out for ride hailing when we can get rid of all the drivers and replace them with autonomous vehicles. Of course, it doesn't feel great for the drivers. I wonder, how do you see the interaction between these trends in terms of gig economy as a source of jobs, but then also where everyone's kind of looking over the hill to an autonomous future where those jobs are not there, maybe?
Yeah. See, for a country like India, I think more broadly also, be it the United States or UK or Australia, wherever we operate in the developed world also, gig economy is going to create a large amount of jobs in the near to mid future, is what my belief is, across industries. And already we've seen that in the ride sharing industry, we've seen that in the food delivery industry, we're seeing that increasingly in gigification of tasks which can be outsourced to different people. And in some ways, India, being a slightly more unorganized labor market, traditionally always had some elements of the gig economy, because unlike the West, Indian labor market was not as organized. Everybody was not in a full-time job. So many of these elements were always there in the Indian economy. Specifically, when I look at India, I believe some sort of formalization of the gig economy worker, which gives flexibility to the worker, and along with that flexibility to the platform like us, will really take it much more beyond. And to the Indian government's credit, they've been one of the first, most innovative governments in the world which have come up with a gig economy, a worker insurance clause and they take some fees from us as platforms and from all platforms to provide a kind of a pool for insurance for gig workers. And it's a very innovative model. I believe it will work really well for countries like India. And if some kind of formalization can come in, which keeps the flexibility and benefits for both parties, I believe gig workers will only scale up in India across industries, across logistics and mobility industries, or even restaurants, or across any kind of format of work, even work at home on digital platforms. Now, coming to the other question on the impact of AI, I actually have a contrarian view on this. I actually believe, obviously some jobs will go away because of AI. But in general, in the next decade or so at least, and beyond a decade, I can't visualize beyond a decade yet, but till about a decade, I actually believe AI will help increase productivity of all kinds of workers. And that's even more relevant for a country like India, where, in general, skilled manpower is less. And skilled, even a driver in India is a skilled manpower, because there are a lot of people in India who don't even know how to drive. So when we look at our business, we actually find a paucity of drivers, or trained drivers who know how to drive a car well and who know how to do good customer service. So the applications of AI over the next decade or so will be much more enabling of higher productivity and higher efficiency and quality of service across worker types. And if you think of a doctor, for example, I believe an Indian doctor, if he serves 20 patients today, he might be able to serve 100 patients tomorrow. And doctors in India are very underpenetrated, just like anything else, be it teachers, or be it even our drivers, etc. If AI can help drivers avoid accidents on the road, that's great, right? It helps improve the whole experience for and the end-to-end value for everybody. In the long term, with AI maturing, there will be a point, I believe, when AI will mature, that there'll be fully autonomous vehicles. There'll be much more autonomous work in our call centers and in our banks, etc. Now, I don't think anybody knows the perfect future out then, but maybe there'll be new types of jobs created. There'll be a lot of data labeling jobs opened up as a result, because of Indian AI still needs a lot of backroom work. That's an opportunity for companies in India. So I'm an optimist and a contrarian on this point.
I like it. We've got just a couple minutes left here, and so I wanted to throw in one more additional question that kind of relates possibly to the geopolitics of technology theme. Early on in our conversation, you said, right now people are talking about a China model and a US model and the competition between those, but you think an India model is coming forward and presents real opportunities. I wonder if you could flesh that out a little bit more and talk about what you see as maybe the biggest obstacles and opportunities for stuff like UPI, the various elements of the India stack, to be spread to other countries in, say, Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Do you see this as something that requires maybe an active hand of the Indian government to do this type of promotion work, or do you see it mostly happening at the level of companies like your own entering these markets and being to spread that model?
I believe, Matt, it'll go hand in hand. There'll be an increasing role that governments like the Indian government will play, and in a more multilateral world versus a unilateral or a bilateral world, that whole third model will also benefit. And in a much more in a world where countries like India, Australia, UK, maybe Europe have a larger role to play in the geopolitics, I actually believe technology paradigms, technology protocols will be much more broader accepted around the world. And in general, the way things are going, I'm not a geopolitical expert, but I believe there'll be much more collaboration between regional powers like India, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Australia, and maybe in Europe, amongst Europe themselves. So the adoption of technology will happen faster in all of these markets, and the collaboration between these companies and businesses and across both all kinds of track dialogues will happen more, which will lead to much more broadly accepted paradigms like UPI. So if the Indian government has a better partnership with the African continent through different multilateral forums, I believe it'll help Indian businesses to play a more larger role in the global scene.
Okay, I believe we are right up against time, and so we're going to have to stop it there. But Bhavish, thanks so much for sharing those insights. I really enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot from it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. It was a wonderful conversation and great to be here.
Okay, have a good one. Bye-bye.